conservative, constitutional. It's the Andrew Cooperrider Show, keeping you informed on what's going on right here in Kentucky.
Today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show, the cost of our state government's crusade to turn Kentucky into an electric vehicle manufacturing hub continues to rack up costs as another $100 million is set aside in our most recent state budget for infrastructure in order to help with the Blue Oval plant. The conversation on Beshear's vetoes continues where we left off yesterday with Senate Bill 259. Beshear is also throwing a fit over the emergency spending limitations in the budget, so we'll be going over what he's vetoing there. We'll have all that and more today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. But first, starting us off, I got a message from somebody who listens to the show. And if you want to reach out to the show, you want to comment, question, concern, feel free. You can head on over to theandrewshow.com. There's a contact page there where you can go ahead and submit your comment there, and I'll respond either on air or possibly in email. And if you want to just email me directly, you can just email info@theandrewshow.com. But somebody sent over a message asking me to please stop chewing candy while on the air. So for those of you who've noticed, I've been doing that at all. It's not candy. It's cough drops. I have had a bad cough for the last 3 or 4 weeks. And so while I've been on the air and been recording, sometimes I'll be sucking on cough drops as I'm going through this in order to go ahead and control the cough. I didn't realize anybody else was picking it up, but I got a message telling me, hey, I can hear it. Can you do something about that? And I have no problem doing that. You don't hurt my feelings by reaching out and pointing out something. If there's an issue with the audio, you're hearing something kind of weird that's making it hard for you to listen. If there's an issue along those lines, please let me know. You know, there's been many things over my time that I should have been interested in listening to, podcasts or radio shows or whatever, and just the audio was so unlistenable. The person was completely unlistenable that it makes you tune out. So if you like the show, but you have comments or anything you think could help improve it, that's reasonable. You know, I can't do a whole lot of things. I am but a man trying to, of course, bring you the news of Kentucky. You feel free. Once again, you can reach out to me at theandrewshow.com. So I did want to do that. Also was stated was, hey, I like listening to you, but I don't agree with everything you say, and that's fine too. You don't have to agree with every single thing I say to still enjoy the show. In fact, I find it's more interesting when you kind of disagree a little bit with what somebody's saying, so that way you at least know that you are not a monolith of thought necessarily. You know, if you're always agreeing with me, that could be a problem. But, I mean, sometimes you can just always agree with me. And if you are somebody who always agrees with everything I'm saying, that's fantastic too. If you could, please reach out to my wife and let her know to always agree with me. That would be absolutely fantastic. So in this most recent budget, the state government set aside another $100 million. In fact, Blue Oval SK, which is the Ford, of course, is building their battery plant there in Hardin County near E-Town, Elizabethtown, and they partnered with this South Korean firm called SK Batteries. So they're partnered together. It's SK Blue Oval building this factory. And so for those of you unaware or don't remember, just to remind you because it's infuriating, back in 2021, our state government met and decided to give $410 million to this project. All they had to do was, according to the bill that was actually passed to give them the money, was to invest a few $1 billion. And as long as they invested a few $1 billion, they would get the money. That was the bill passed. There may have been other things to the deal that the economic cabinet added on, but the actual appropriation of funds that was done by our legislature in 2021 in the special session was $410 million. In exchange, you had to invest at least, I think it was $2.5 billion. Now, those of you who listen to the show know that, you know, Ford and SK had that $2.5 billion because the federal government had given Ford right around about $8-9 billion to go ahead and build several electric vehicle battery manufacturing plants in Southern America. So, Ford and SK, they're actually not really out a whole lot of money, all considering on the deal, because their initial investment that they're bringing in, the few billion that was required to get the state's $410 million, well, they just got that from the federal government. So they're not actually on the hook for quite a lot. But they decide to go ahead and do this. When legislators approve those monies, they had no idea who they were giving it to. They had no idea what the project is. They have not a single idea. All they knew was they were told it's a really, really great project. And despite the fact that this was essentially a blind vote, that you got to pass it to know what's in it, basically, all but, I think, right around a total in both Senate and House, only 15 members voted no on giving $410 million to they didn't know who. So basically secretly giving out $410 million. They didn't know, once again, they had no clue that it was to Ford to build an electric vehicle battery plant. So once they passed the bill and they were aware of what's in the bill, $410 million for this project, they then find out it's for the Ford battery plant. Everybody's all excited. But then we've now gotten news, of course, as Ford has announced that lagging demand for electric vehicles has certainly caused a delay in them opening the second part of the plant, and they've revised down the amount of jobs they're bringing from 6,000 jobs down to about 2,500 jobs. On top of that, the electric vehicles is being heavily subsidized by the Biden administration right now. And part of the risk for Kentucky is that Biden loses and the Trump administration comes in, stops subsidizing this push for electric vehicles as they should. And now in turn, that then causes even more slowdowns or less demand. And this amazing $410 million cost to the Kentucky taxpayer project ends up being a big bust or really not producing a whole lot of jobs. But if you thought the cost was only $410 million, you are mistaken, because you see in our most recent budget bill, and this is the other thing people don't want to talk about, and they don't address, when they decide to give $410 million to Ford, they say, okay, that's it, we're done. It's $410 million to Ford, that's all we got to give, and we'll get these 5,000 jobs. But no. It's not just $410 million to Ford. You now also have to spend money improving the infrastructure for Ford around the area. Local government's got to give them money. You got to give them more money from the state to continue on. Because once you have them on the hook, because once Ford has gotten that $410 million from the state, well, the state can't afford to not acquiesce to whatever Ford asks them to do, because they can't allow this project to be a bust. Because giving out $410 million to a private company, and then that private, already that should be a problem for everybody who's a good conservative here in Kentucky. That should be a big issue. But if that project fails, if it doesn't produce those jobs for you, that is political suicide. So they can't afford to not give them whatever they asked for. And what Ford wanted, and they spent a massive amount, let me tell you. They spent all of $25,000 lobbying our state legislature, because they really didn't. I'm surprised they had to spend anything. I'm surprised they didn't just call up Stivers and Osborne and Beshear and say, this is how much we need, send it over. But they spent all of $25,000 lobbying on the budget in order to get $100 million sent over to Hardin and Warren counties to help with their infrastructure improvements that are needed for the Ford battery plant. So now what costs $410 million at the state level is costing at least $510 million, not to mention some of the other battery plants that got another $110 million. Before it's all said and done, before a single person has been hired to actually manufacture a battery here in Kentucky, I will not be surprised if the actual total cost of state level monies, tax handouts, local level monetary handouts, infrastructure projects, the list goes on and on. If the total amount of that all added up, all the handouts in order to turn Kentucky into this electric vehicle manufacturing hub, ends up being nearly $1 billion in taxpayer funds. And yet nobody along the way has ever sat down to show us the numbers of how long this will take to pay off. Is this good investment with the taxpayer funds? Nobody showed us the work because they don't feel a need to. Well, coming up after this, we'll be digging into some of Beshear's vetoes, starting with Senate Bill 259, continuing that discussion from yesterday. You're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. And you're back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. So yesterday, I started going through some of Beshear's vetoes, and we stopped on Senate Bill 259, as I'll talk to you all about it a little bit, but it deals with something called the West End Opportunity Board. This is out of Louisville. And the West End Opportunity Board is a TIF. It is a tax improvement district. And the initial idea of a TIF, I kind of don't necessarily disagree with. So the idea behind setting these up is that when you have an area that needs, in the opinion of the government, a fair amount of extra development, what they'll do is they set up a taxing district in an area and they say, okay, this West End needs extra help, so they now will get their own kind of council, city council, think of it like that way. They'll get their own board that will now bring in 80%, in this case, 80% of every dollar beyond current tax revenue. So in 2021, if they're looking at, let's say West End Louisville was bringing in $50 million in tax revenue. And now they set up this TIF. Well, this city continues to get their $50 million, but any tax dollar over that $50 million, 80% of it now goes to the board. And then the board is supposed to spend that to help vitalize the area and create opportunity in the area, so on and so forth. I already think we tax too much, and, what is government's job when it comes to private industry and all that. I disagree with that. But beyond the fact that I just generally disagree with government believing it's in the job of investments, if you accept the idea that city councils and state governments and all those exist and they pull in tax revenue and they spend it, well, that's kind of what a TIF is, except a TIF isn't elected per se. And this is where I definitely start to get off board, where I'm like, okay, you can't even say, well, government's kind of already collecting up money, so at least this is a way to more localize the spending, which you could kind of draw me in with initially, but then you lose me when you tell me how this board is actually formed. And the West End Opportunity Board was formed by a bill back in 2021. It's important to know that because, as I mentioned yesterday, in 2021, that was after the summer of Black Lives Matter, the Breonna Taylor and everything else, in that legislative session, we saw our so-called Republican majority pass a fair amount of pieces of legislation that was pretty liberal on the side of buying into the beliefs of groups like Black Lives Matter. And I gave examples last time of that and why their thought process is wrong. So we're not going to go back down into that. But it does bleed through in this board when we look at how they decide to put the board together. So, as I said, if this board was just people elected from the area, that'd be fine and dandy. But it's not. Instead, the board is one member who's appointed by the governor, one member who's appointed by the mayor. So far, we're okay, right? Just the governor can just appoint anybody, and this is a normal board, right? I mean, if you think of this as tax dollars being spent by a government entity, this is kind of how government normally operates, where individuals appoint people or put people in charge of the departments of spending money. And now they're appointing them, which means they get to serve 2 years. It's harder to remove them. It's harder to fire them. But it's still not quite in the deep end of where I start to really pull the plug. But it says, so member the governor appoints. A member appointed by the mayor of Louisville. A member of the legislative council of Louisville. So that's the city council. So one member of the city council appointed by its members. One member that the mayor appoints. One member that the governor appoints. Then a representative of the University of Louisville, appointed by its board of trustees for the term of 3 years. A representative of Simmons College of Kentucky. And that is now starting to get on shifty ground. And this is where it gets even worse. The following shall be appointed by the governor: one member of the NAACP, one member of One West Louisville, one member from the Louisville Urban League, one member from the Federal Reserve Bank in Louisville, one member from the Volunteers of America Mid-States in Louisville, one member from the locally based foundation with assets over of a locally based foundation with assets over 100 million, and one member from a bank with local assets greater than $1 billion. And that's the initial appointments. And then after that, the board shall include in its bylaws a process for appointing one member from each of the 9 neighborhoods in the development area as additional members. So already we have this board. Okay, you got some people appointed by the governor, not elected by the people of that area. Okay. Then you have members of NAACP, which is, obviously it's a political activism organization, but the fact that it would have a board member in charge of sitting on a board, in charge of spending taxpayer funds, is questionable. I don't like that. I don't like how One West gets to put forward one, Louisville Urban League gets to put forward, Volunteers and Mid-America. I mean, these are the Federal Reserve Bank in Louisville. These are not government entities, but yet because the legislature has now given them power to have say-so in spending taxpayer funds. And then the board gets to figure out how they appoint members from the neighborhood. So if you don't agree with their viewpoints, well, they won't appoint you, right? And then on top of that, and this is where it really shines through, where keep in mind, this board was formed by a conservative, so-called Republican majority legislature was the one who put this together. So you already have people not a part of government, not electing individuals not accountable to the voters to oversee taxpayer funds, and then those people getting to pick people to sit on the board, not the people of the area voting for somebody. And then there's another rider that the so-called Republican legislators put in here that says that the membership of the board, the majority of the board's membership, shall reflect the racial majority of the residents living in the development area. And so that means that if the area is predominantly, let's say, black, then the members on the board have to be black. The majority of them have to be black. If it's white, the majority have to be white. If it's Asian, the majority would have to be Asian. Which goes into and literally flies against the entire idea of meritocracy that conservatives and Republicans are supposed to support, that we are supposed to view as the way we should run things. Because now people aren't just getting appointed because they're just happen to be a part of certain organizations, not because they're a part of government, not because they're voted on, but also now getting appointed based simply upon the color of their skin as well. They're not picking the best people for the job. They're picking the people with the right skin hue for the job. And then top it all off, they add on as a prerequisite to service, each appointee to the board and each member of the West End Louisville Advisory Council shall participate in a board-sanctioned training program on the topics of community and economic development, finance, equity, and community engagement, gentrification, and the implications of these concepts. So not only are these people not elected by the members, I mean, keep in mind, they're taking 80% of every dollar that the city is taxing from the people in the district above 2021 levels, 80% of every additional dollar, which to date is tens of millions of dollars now that they have control over. And they have racial hiring quotas. They're appointing people from places that are not elected people, not members of government. And now also they're required to go through a training programs that are approved by the board. How would you ever have the actual thing we need when we're looking at an area, diversity of thought? Because I'll tell you this much right now, the NAACP has been along for a long time. One West Louisville has been around for a little while. Louisville Urban League, been around. Volunteers of Mid-America, been around. Federal Reserve Bank, been around. All these groups have been around for quite some time, and yet the problems of West End Louisville have persisted. Maybe we need some people to come in with different and fresh ideas that aren't being trained to think a certain way in order to actually solve the problems in front of us. So why did Beshear actually veto the bill? Well, the bill wasn't setting up this board. It already existed. What the bill was doing was making it to where now these member organizations like the NAACP and others, instead of just putting forward who they want on the board, they were saying that they want it to be where NAACP and others have to put forward two options, and then the board gets to pick between one of the two for who ends up on the board. So when a term expires, they can pick one of the two. And the reason why is because apparently there's been this huge tiff between the NAACP member of the board and the rest of the board. They say it's over the fact that this, West End Opportunity Partnership has, tens of millions of dollars and hasn't done anything in 2 years because they're still taking time to consider everything. And they really haven't done much, which, shocker, government having done much. Ooh, color me shocked. But apparently they're not getting along well with the rest of the board. And so they wanted NAACP and others to put forward two picks that they could choose from. And they put that in its bylaws, but NAACP apparently was only putting forward one choice, or only wants to put forward one choice and not give them two. So this bill would also say that a member organization, if they don't follow the bylaws passed by the board, that then that member organization can have its membership to the board removed by the other members of the board. So basically the NAACP could be kicked off the board, and Beshear vetoed it, saying that it opens up opportunity for people who without ideas or has ties to the area to come in and influence over the area. My point is this board should never have been formed in this way in the first place. If you want to say, hey, these people in this area, we want them to be able to finance their own futures, so let's put together this special TIF that's elected by the people of the community, that's responsive to the people of the community, and then if the community ends up wasting its own tax dollars and spending it in ridiculous ways and continuing to fall down into an endless black hole of poverty, then that is their choice. They've been given the opportunities. A lot of issues here, but coming up after this, Beshear's upset at the budget and its emergency spending allowances. We'll go over that after this short break. You're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. And you're back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show. So Andy Beshear is not very happy with the budget that the legislature has passed. He's already indicated he'll be line item vetoing several parts of it, one of which being to do with the emergencies and capping a spending on emergencies at $25 million per fiscal year. Now understand, okay, capping at a certain point that, at any point, if Beshear needs more money for something, he can always call the legislature into session and they can pass a new appropriations bill in order to appropriate more funds. So keep that in mind. I need you to know that, okay? Because we're about to hear Andy Beshear at a press conference give an opinion on something, and I want to make sure you're aware that he can call, the way you get more money is you call the legislators back into session and then they can pass a new piece of bill with funding. But let's listen to what Andy Beshear had to say about this specific part of the budget.
The current pending state budget, for the very first time in our history, would limit the amount an executive branch can spend or expend in response to a natural disaster, and not a limitation after any individual one, but over the course of a year. To give you an example, we would have exceeded the cap that they are setting in the first 3 to 4 months of this fiscal year. In just 3 to 4 months, we'd be out of money that we're allowed to spend to respond to a natural disaster. Now, some say that there's another pot that's sitting out there we can use. No, that under the budget can only go towards FEMA matches. FEMA matches can be a year, 2 or 3 years later. You can't use them for the immediate emergency response. And that means we've now had at least 2 major weather events. Again, the tornadoes in Trimble and Carroll County and the damage in Gallatin County, as well as this storm that's impacted so many counties that we would have been over the amount. And it would have taken either a special session or calling people back in the veto period for us to simply respond. And think about how long that takes and how long a bill takes to pass. Those are precious moments, minutes, hours, and days where we have to be responding immediately.
I don't think Beshear and me have the same definition of like what is emergency spending and funding. And this probably points to part of the reason why the legislators decided to put a cap on it. So his argument is that we wouldn't have time. So it takes too long to put together a spending package and a special session and to get another appropriations bill passed to handle emergency response. So if we run out of money for emergencies, we need more money, and it would take just too long, and it will cost us precious moments. Well, first thing, Beshear's already stated is that they would have ran out of money in 4 months. So you think, well, that could be a problem, but keep in mind, all Beshear had to do is every time after a emergency hit and they spent money, if they were concerned about the funding levels, he would call a special session asking for more money to refill the emergency fund. And also, by the way, that would offer up opportunities for more people in the legislature, because they have different tools that they're allowed to do. They can pass laws. They can appropriate a lot more funds. They can spend on very specific things. So that actually gets the people who do have the authorization to spend a lot of money on different things involved in the process as well early on. So that way we're not waiting until next session for them to pass, a spending package to help with some sort of housing or something like that. He's already made it clear that it is more than enough money for them to be able to actually respond to at least a emergency, because he's responded to 2 and has just now exceeded that 25 million. So just call in the session in order to have that discussion if you need more money. But also, I think we do need to define what is it exactly that is emergency that we're spending money on. What is emergency response spending? And what is not as much emergency response spending, but not the emergency's over. We're just spending in response to a natural disaster. And to give you like an example of what the difference would be, right? Imagine your refrigerator breaks, okay? The emergency response is not going out and buying a $2,000 refrigerator. That may be the end result. That may be after a few weeks what you end up doing, or after some time as you gather together funding or whatever you have to do personally to get your hands on a $2,000 refrigerator, right? If you were to go out and get a nice one or go find a used one or what have you. But if you need to deal with your food is going to go bunk now, it's going to go bad now, the emergency response is to go out and buy ice and put your food in coolers or put ice in the fridge and freezers to try to keep your food as cool as possible, or get your food up together quickly and take it over to your neighbor's house to put it in their fridge or freezer, or your parents, or wherever. But the emergency is to get your food into a fridge and freezer as soon as you can. The emergency response then is to do that, not to go out and buy a refrigerator. Unexpected spending, I think, would be a better claim. And then when that comes time to make an unexpected spending decision, that would be your long-term solution. But in the same way, and the reason why I'm using this example is because it's the best way I can relate it to what happens in your own household. But in the same way that when you have an unexpected spending that you weren't planning on in response to an emergency situation, like in this case, your fridge breaking, well, the decision of what to do in the long term, now that is a greater discussion. Just like you don't want to go out and just say, well, my friend's got a used fridge next door. I'm going to go buy that for a couple $100 and just go buy that without asking your wife what to do. In a normal household, in a standard household, generally speaking, unless you just have tons of money and it's not something you have to think about, but if your family budgets at all and a refrigerator is a more expensive thing, what do? You get with your wife, you get with your spouse if you have one, get with the decision makers, and you sit down and you figure out which fridge you're going to buy, which model, what your budget is, how much can you spend. But you don't have that conversation. You're not making the decision in the moment to spend that. You're making the decision to go out and get ice. You're making the decision to go move your food over to the other fridge. And I think that's the thing Beshear doesn't get. That's not what he's understanding here. What he's talking about, what he is sometimes spending, quote unquote, emergency dollars on, are not actual emergency spending. It's just unexpected spending. But he is not alone. He is not a dictator. He is to engage with our legislators who represent us because he's not spending his money. He's not spending money that's been priorly approved to be given to him. He's spending now money that belongs to the taxpayer. And therefore, when you're talking about long-term solutions in response to an emergency, well, now you need to have a conversation with whose money you're spending or who's elected to represent those whose money you're spending. And the other question too would be, what does the state actually spend money on when it comes to the actual response side of things, right? You got National Guard. So obviously, that's part of their budget. You got the National Guard coming out that could help in a natural disaster. But a lot of times, like I said, the emergency is, hey, we need to get, cots set up in a gymnasium for people to stay in for a few days, or we need to get hotel rooms purchased for these people. We need to set that up for a few weeks. Then, now let's call legislature into session. Let's take a week or two to have a discussion on what the proper response is to this. Let's get together and let's pass a bill. And keep in mind, too, several months out of the year, the legislature's already meeting. So really, it would just be basically from May till December, right? That's, what is that? 5, 6, 7 months? 7 months. So it's over 7 months' time that he would have to call a special session. But Beshear, he doesn't want to call them in because Beshear hates working with the Republicans. That's just what it is. He doesn't like picking up the phone. He doesn't like calling the legislature and anything he can do to avoid that. So, of course, he's throwing a fit about the fact that he doesn't get to spend willy-nilly on emergencies anymore and get to put his names on the checks and have the check signing out ceremonies. Beshear, if it takes you 4 months to spend $25 million and your complaint is that it takes a few weeks to have a special session, they are giving you more than enough money. You can respond to your emergencies, and you have the time to call a session in to give you more money between emergencies if you need to. But that would require you to learn how to work well with others, and you don't like that. Well, coming up after this, we'll be digging into a few other of Beshear's vetoes. We'll have all that here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. We'll be back in a few short minutes. And you're back in the final segment here of the Andrew Cooperrider Show. So, going into Friday, starts the final 2 days of session. The governor has been going through and vetoing quite a few pieces of legislation, and I wanted to zero in on just a couple of those and kind of go through his veto messages on them as well. First, I wanted to talk about House Bill 388. So for those of you who are unaware, don't remember, House Bill 388, of course, is the bill that would make the mayor elections and the city council elections there in Louisville now nonpartisan. They are partisan now, Democrat, Republican, but this would make them nonpartisan, much the same way like city councils are in Lexington. And actually city councils are in almost all cities I know of in Kentucky. I know Hopkinsville does some very interesting something. They do like a weird city council thing where they're partisan and they're district based and you have to live in the district, but apparently everybody in the city gets to vote on all members of all districts. You don't have to live in the district just to vote for the member. So you get to vote for every member of city council, but the city council member who's running for that seat has to live in that district. And so that's kind of interesting. So that's so there are some places that do partisan, but a lot of them do nonpartisan. And I think actually the majority of Kentucky cities do nonpartisan. So this bill takes away that party indicator and makes it nonpartisan. And the reason they're doing this is straightforward and simple. It's got nothing to do with anything other than Republicans think they will win more elections in Louisville for the city council and for the mayor. And that's it. That's the only reason why, because they're not worried about ending partisan elections in any other place. They're not worried about ending, talking about making other races partisan. I mean, one of the bills actually being considered this session was a bill to make school board elections partisan. And that is something that a lot of people believe in, making school board elections partisan, making judge races partisan. I mean, you want to talk about elections where partisanship would help, it would be judges, because at least with judges, with a party, you would actually figure out something. Because when it comes to judge races, and I've said this before on the show, and I think it's an absolute travesty, and we really need to take a look at how our judges are elected and what the quote-unquote rules are for judges, because for a long time, they couldn't even indicate that they were conservative. That was like a rule they thought they had. But if you try to ask a judge can't, supposedly, this is what they'll tell you, the candidates, they're nonpartisan. If you ask them about partisanship, some of them will still quote that, I can't really go into partisanship or not because we're legally mandated to keep that out of judges' elections, even though that's been proven in court to not be the case. But some of them will still claim that. So they're nonpartisan. They'll try to claim that they can't talk about partisan things, or they'll just come up with a lot of different ways to tell you that, whatever party they're in, or they can just lie to you because you'd have to go get an open records request to figure that out. So they're nonpartisan. They for a long time couldn't tell what party they were in. They also can't tell you how they would rule on cases. So they can't tell you, like, if you want to know, like you're electing somebody for the state Supreme Court. That's an election going on right now. State Supreme Court election in November. And so let's say you wanted to know how they would rule on the abortions case that's coming before them. You want to know how they would rule on, I don't know, whether or not they would approve the school choice amendment that's before, that was just voted on and passed, whether or not they would allow that to stand on the ballot. So maybe you want to ask those questions. Well, they're not allowed, quote unquote, allowed to tell you how they would rule on cases. So they run for an elected position. They, for a long time, couldn't tell you what party they are, but now they can, but they'll still try to claim they can't. It's nonpartisan. You have no party indicator on the ballot, and they can't tell you how they'd rule on cases. So the only way you would know to know anything about a judge would be if you know about their case history, what they've ruled on, and even that can be really difficult to access and figure out. And so it takes just about attorneys are the only people who actually know whether or not a judge is a good judge or not. And so at that point, attorney races become just all about money and like attacking on dumb things or not. They talk a lot about experience and that's it. But how do you know if a person's going to be a good judge or a bad judge? So anyways, there's been a big push amongst a lot of Republicans and bills proposed to make a lot of these nonpartisan elections partisan. But this year, they've taken steps to make partisan elections in Louisville nonpartisan simply because Republicans think it'll help them in elections. And Republicans should just be honest about that. We think it'll help us in elections. In the same way, Beshear should just be honest that he's vetoing it because he thinks it will hurt Democrats in elections in Louisville. But instead, Beshear, in his veto message for House Bill 388, decided to say that he was vetoing 388 because the people of Louisville dutifully, by vote, decided to have partisan elections, and who is the General Assembly to come in and tell them what to do, which is kind of a stupid argument. If you just want to say it's bad for my party and the Republicans are only passing it because it's good for their party, I'd actually respect that argument, and in a way I'd agree with you because I don't actually think we should be changing the rules and how elections operate just because you don't like the outcomes of them. I think in the long run it could come back to bite you. And once again, Lexington's nonpartisan, and there's not really a conservative member on our city council. There's one or two that may claim to be Republican by registration, but they are not conservative, to say the least. So, but anyways, there's a lot of assumptions that Republicans would end up more so getting elected. But my point is simply that just be honest about it. But instead, Beshear says, the people of Louisville voted for this. Well, they voted for this was the 1960s. I mean, 1969, I believe, was the first elected mayor of Louisville. So, 1968 would have been when that vote took place, I think. 1968 or 1966, somewhere in there, would have been when the vote took place to merge Louisville and Jefferson County to be one city together as one. And if you were 18 years old in 1968, you would be 74 today. So literally almost every single person that wasn't in their 20s, and that wasn't probably, a lot of people probably didn't vote that were in their 20s. So almost every single person, like 90% probably, of the people that voted to make those elections partisan are dead. I'm not trying to be brash, I'm just being honest. They're dead. So, no, objectively speaking, the people of Louisville that currently live in Louisville did not vote to make the elections partisan. Now, should they have to take another vote to make it partisan or nonpartisan? No, I'm not saying they should. Is there a process for them to petition for that change? I don't think there is. And if there isn't, we should set up one, right? But the point is Beshear's claim that, well, the people of Louisville voted for this is just ridiculous. They didn't. Those people are dead. But you can say, hey, it's bad for my party, and the Republicans are only doing it because it's good for theirs, and I would respect that argument. Turning now to one more veto I want to cover, and that would be the veto on House Bill 513. So House Bill 513 was the bill that moves the Historic Properties Advisory Commission. It says that in order for them to remove or change any kind of items in the Capitol, rotunda, object of art, within the Capitol building, that the Historic Properties Advisory would have to get approval from the General Assembly before they could execute that removal. Now, they say this is not in response to the Jefferson Davis statue. It obviously is. So I'm going to read the veto message that Beshear put forward. He said, House Bill 513 is an encroachment on the authority of the executive branch and the property it owns and manages. Such encroachment has taken many forms, from claiming ownership and management of parking spaces to the General Assembly now assuming the role of curator. House Bill 513 would strip the authority of the Historic Properties Advisory Commission over a statue, monument, or object of art, and only the new state capitol rotunda, and would give final approval to the General Assembly. Under the bill, the commission would have had no authority to have voted for the removal of the statue of Jefferson Davis, something that remained in the People's House for far too long. For these reasons, I'm vetoing House Bill 388. This is House Bill 513. He did a copy-paste of his veto message from House Bill 388, it would appear, and forgot to change one of the 388s to House Bill 513. So typo by the governor's office there in the veto message, stating that he was vetoing House Bill 388 for those reasons, even though in the message he's talking about 513. And at the top it says 513. So oopsie daisies. So anyways, so he's pointing out that this is obviously over the Jefferson Davis statue. And he's saying he's vetoing it because they should have been allowed to remove it, which is kind of interesting that he says, well, under this, the commission wouldn't have been able to remove the rotunda, and that should have happened. Now, you could say that the statue could be removed. That's not really a very good argument, because what you'd be saying is that the legislature would never vote to remove the statue, which means the legislature is supposed to be the people's house, the voice of the people. So if Beshear's saying that the people would never want, as a whole, as a majority, to remove the Jefferson Davis statue, then the question becomes, why did Beshear feel needed to remove it in the first place as well? But, well, y'all, that's what we have time for today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Thank you all so much for joining me. We'll be back here tomorrow. I hope you have a great rest of your day.